The guns fall silent, the world lies in ruins, and one nation stands almost untouched, holding more industrial capacity, more gold reserves, and more raw military power than has ever existed in one place in human history. What America chose to do with that power, and, just as importantly, what story it chose to tell about why it deserved that power, would shape the next 80 years of global history. This is the story of the American century, a genuine, world-changing project of rebuilding shattered nations and containing totalitarian expansion, told alongside a parallel history of coups, covert interventions, and domestic upheaval that rarely made it into the triumphant version. It is the story of a nation that put a man on the moon while denying basic civil rights to millions of its own citizens at home, that preached freedom abroad while overthrowing elected governments it found inconvenient, and that now, in the 21st century, finds itself locked in an unprecedented and very public argument with itself over which version of its own history is actually true. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the United States held a position unlike that of any power in recorded history. Its homeland had suffered no bombing, no invasion, no occupation. Its industrial output, mobilized to a staggering scale for war production, now stood ready to be redirected toward reconstruction. It alone possessed atomic weapons, and it emerged from the war having, for the first time, decisively rejected the isolationism that had defined much of its earlier foreign policy, choosing instead to build and lead a new international order, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial system, and eventually the Marshall Plan, which poured billions of dollars into rebuilding a devastated Western Europe, partly out of genuine humanitarian and diplomatic conviction and partly, quite explicitly, to prevent economically desperate nations from turning to communism. This period produced real, substantial global goods. European economic recovery happened faster and more durably than almost anyone in 1945 predicted, while simultaneously serving very calculated American strategic interests, a duality that would characterize nearly every major American foreign policy initiative for the rest of the century. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany between the United States and the Soviet Union curdled into rivalry within months of victory, hardening into what became known as the Cold War, a decades-long global contest for ideological, military, and economic supremacy that never erupted into direct war between the two superpowers but was fought with devastating intensity through proxies across nearly every continent. American memory of this period is dominated by certain fixed images: the Berlin airlift, in which American and British pilots flew food and coal into a blockaded West Berlin rather than abandon it to Soviet pressure; the tense standoff of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, resolved through careful diplomacy that averted what could have been nuclear war; the long twilight struggle finally ending with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, presented in American retelling as vindication, proof that freedom and free markets had simply proven superior to totalitarian communism, that history itself had reached, in the words of one famous 1989 essay, its end. This triumphant framing, while capturing something real about the genuine appeal of political and economic liberty to people living under authoritarian rule, tends to omit or minimize an entire parallel history of the same Cold War period. The numerous instances in which the United States, in the name of containing communism, intervened covertly to overthrow democratically elected governments it judged insufficiently friendly to American interests. In 1953, the CIA helped orchestrate the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the country's oil industry, and helped restore the autocratic Shah to full power, an intervention many historians directly connect to the anti-American sentiment that fueled the 1979 Iranian Revolution decades later. In 1954, the CIA backed a coup against Guatemala's elected president Jacobo Arbenz after his land reforms threatened the interests of the American-owned United Fruit Company. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the United States supported or directly assisted authoritarian regimes and military juntas across Latin America, Chile, where the CIA supported efforts that contributed to the 1973 overthrow of elected President Salvador Allende and his replacement by the brutal dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, is among the most extensively documented cases, with declassified U.S. records confirming direct American involvement in destabilization efforts preceding the coup. These interventions were justified at the time and are still defended by some historians and policymakers today as necessary evils in a global struggle against a genuinely expansionist and often brutal Soviet-aligned communism, a defense with real strategic logic behind it. But they sit uneasily, to say the least, alongside a national narrative built around America as the world's champion of democracy and self-determination, and this tension, real strategic necessity versus stated democratic ideals, and how far the gap between them stretched, remains a genuinely and actively contested question among historians rather than a settled matter. Domestically, the same post-war decades that saw America presenting itself abroad as the leader of the free world were also the decades in which millions of its own citizens were still denied the most basic elements of that freedom at home. Jim Crow segregation remained the legal order across the American South well into the 1960s, enforced not merely by law but by pervasive and often lethal violence against those who challenged it. The civil rights movement that rose to confront this system, through the Montgomery bus boycott beginning in 1955, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the 1963 March on Washington, and finally the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, represents one of the genuine high points of American moral achievement, a mass movement that forced the nation to begin, imperfectly and incompletely, living up to the founding language it had proclaimed but never fully honored. Since 1776, it is telling and historically significant that this movement succeeded partly because Cold War competition gave the federal government additional incentive to address it. American segregation was a constant propaganda liability, cited repeatedly by Soviet media to discredit American claims of moral leadership among the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia that both superpowers were courting. Domestic justice and international strategy, once again, moved together rather than in separate lanes, a pattern that runs through nearly the entire American century. The 1960s and early 70s brought a cascade of upheavals that badly strained the confident post-war narrative. The assassinations of President Kennedy in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy both in 1968, the escalating and increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam, which the government had publicly misrepresented in scale and progress for years, as later confirmed by the leaked Pentagon Papers in 1971, and the Watergate scandal, which forced President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974. After revelations that his administration had orchestrated political espionage and then attempted to cover it up at the highest levels of government. Vietnam in particular represents one of the most significant ruptures in modern American self-conception. A war entered under the same containment logic that had justified earlier Cold War interventions, escalated on the basis of an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin whose details the government exaggerated to secure congressional authorization, and ultimately lost, ending in the humiliating 1975 evacuation of Saigon, at a cost of roughly 58,000 American lives and an estimated 1 to 3 million Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian deaths. For a nation whose entire foundational story rested on inevitable, righteous progress, Vietnam introduced something new into American historical memory. The real possibility of moral and strategic failure, self-inflicted rather than imposed by an external villain. The Cold War's final act unfolded through the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan, who combined a massive military buildup with sustained rhetorical pressure on what he termed the evil empire, while the Soviet Union, weighed down by its own economic stagnation and the reform efforts of Mikhail Gorbachev, entered a terminal decline that culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the formal dissolution of the USSR in December 1991. American popular memory has, understandably, claimed this outcome as a decisive vindication of the entire post-war project, proof that the system was right all along. Most historians take a more layered view, Soviet collapse resulted from a combination of internal economic failure, the costly and unwinnable Soviet war in Afghanistan, nationalist pressures within Soviet republics, and Gorbachev's own reforms, alongside genuine external pressure from sustained Western containment. A convergence of causes rather than a single triumphant American cause, though the simpler triumphant version proved, unsurprisingly, far more durable in American popular memory than the more complicated academic consensus. The decade following the Cold War's end, the 1990s, briefly seemed to confirm the triumphant reading, a unipolar moment in which American economic and military power faced no serious rival, and American-style liberal democracy appeared to some observers as the natural, final endpoint of political development everywhere. This confidence was profoundly shaken by the September 11, 2001 attacks, which killed nearly 3,000 people and led directly to the American-led invasions of Afghanistan and, in 2003, Iraq, the latter justified publicly on the basis of intelligence claims about weapons of mass destruction that were never found, a failure of both intelligence and public trust whose consequences, including a prolonged and costly insurgency and regional destabilization, are still being debated by historians and policymakers as among the most significant strategic errors in modern American foreign policy. In the years since, the confident, singular American narrative that had held together, with real strain but real durability, since the founding has fractured more openly than at almost any point in the nation's history. The 2008 financial crisis exposed deep structural weaknesses in the American economic model. The election of the nation's first black president in 2008 was followed, within a decade, by renewed and highly visible debates over race, policing, and historical memory itself. Debates that reached directly into how American history should be taught, evidenced by fierce public battles over projects like the New York Times' 1619 Project, which sought to reframe the nation's founding around the centrality of slavery, and by state-level legislative fights over how or whether subjects like slavery, segregation, and indigenous displacement should be taught in schools at all. The January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, following the contested 2020 presidential election, marked, in the view of most historians, an unprecedented moment of internal political violence and institutional strain in modern American history, one whose long-term significance is still being actively assessed, and remains a subject of genuine ongoing historical and political dispute rather than settled consensus. What emerges from the full arc of this three-part history is not a simple verdict, not America is exceptional and providentially blessed, and not simply its mirror image inverse, America's founding myths are nothing but lies. Rather, it is a portrait of a nation that has, from its very first colonial footholds, been engaged in a continuous, active process of constructing a usable story about itself, one flexible enough to absorb genuine achievements, the Constitution's Republican innovation, the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the defeat of fascism and later of Soviet totalitarianism, alongside genuine and often deliberately obscured harms, indigenous displacement, slavery and its long aftermath, imperial ventures abroad, covert overthrow of foreign democracies, into a narrative coherent enough to sustain national identity and purpose across 2.5 centuries. Every nation does some version of this. What makes the American case distinctive is the sheer scale of the gap, at almost every turn, between the stated ideal liberty, equality, self-determination, and the historical practice, and the unusual intensity with which Americans themselves, generation after generation, have fought publicly over which version of their own story to believe. That fight is not a sign of the nation's history having failed. It may be, in fact, the most genuinely American thing about it. A country still, after 250 years, arguing in real time over what its own past actually means, and by extension, what it is still allowed to become.